This is the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI, and I am your host, Yaakov Katz. In a major blow to Russia and Iran, Bashar al-Assad's 24-year authoritarian rule has come to an end. His father came to power in 1971, and almost 54 years later, the family that has murdered hundreds of thousands of its own people is gone. For Israel, like most things, this is an event that carries with it opportunity and risk. Opportunity because this is a massive blow to Iran after the evisceration of Hamas, the decimation of Hezbollah's leaders, the weakening of Iran with the destruction of their air defense systems. Now Syria and the Assad regime is off the Iranian chessboard. Iran has seen its dream of regional hegemony come crashing down, and this provides Israel with a unique moment to strengthen anti-regime forces in Iran and possibly even take on Iran's nuclear program. But this is also a risky moment because HTS, the group of rebels leading the fight in Syria, are not exactly liberal progressives, as our guest explains. These are radical Islamists, and they might not want to immediately pick a direct fight with Israel, but Israel does need to be prepared. Our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Spyer, Director of Research at the Middle East Forum. He's a columnist at the Jerusalem Post, where I had the privilege of working with him for a number of years. And he's also a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, an Australian newspaper, and the Spectator magazine. He's one of the few people who has reported extensively from Syria and Iraq over the years. He was actually just there in April. He's also the author of the book Days of the Fall, a reporter's journey in the Syria and Iraq wars. You'll want to listen to what Jonathan has to say about the future of Israel, the future of Syria, and actually the future of the Middle East. Here we go. So, Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us. It's great to see you and have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Yaakov.
Nice to be here. When we dive into the whole question of Syria, let me start with the first question, which, before we kind of go back in time. Is this good for the Jews or is this bad for the Jews?
It's a mix. Predictably, my answer is that it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, it is certainly good for Israel and the Jews that a very, very major component of the Iran-led regional alliance, indeed a central linchpin in many ways, both geographically and in other ways, of Iran-led regional alliance has just been removed from the board, literally in the space of 10 days. That's good because it massively and profoundly weakens the Iran-led regional alliance. And indeed, it is it's the latest episode in a whole series of kind of blows that the hits that the Iran-led regional alliance has taken in recent months. So in that sense, unambiguously, it's good for Israel. And I think overall, the balance will be that it is good for Israel. The caveat, and it's a major one nevertheless, is that, of course, the forces that have just barreled down the spine of Syria's cities and now taken Damascus are not by any means liberal Democrats or forces, or even Arab forces sympathetic.
Or Zionists.
Zionists, they're also not. And even in the kind of, more limited expectations of the region, they're not Arab forces connected to those Arab forces that are, for pragmatic reasons, in a way on Israel's side. United Arab Emirates or maybe Saudi Arabia today, they're not part of that. It's a Sunni Islamist force with Salafi jihadi origins backed by and made possible by the Republic of Turkey. So these are not and by Qatar. So these are not forces sympathetic in any way to Israel. In many ways, they are connected to another regional bloc, which in its own maybe more sophisticated, less direct way, is also profoundly hostile to Israel.
So let's talk for a moment about what made this possible. What changed? Yeah. Obviously, you just hinted kind of like, look, Israel's been at war since October 7th of last year. We've eviscerated Hamas. We've decimated Hezbollah. We've exposed the vulnerabilities of Iran with our attack there in October. The axes that the Iranians, or the Shia crescent, as some people refer to it back in the day, from Iran through Syria to Lebanon, has been pretty much shattered to a large extent. The rebels were what? Just sitting and waiting for this unique opportunity and seized it?
I think there's 2 points to be borne in mind. Firstly, in a way, the rebels were sitting there, in that little enclave in northwest Syria, and specifically HTS in Idlib province, under Turkish protection, quietly building up their military capacity. And I think the Turkish role in this is really important. Erdogan's decision never to completely abandon the Sunni Arab Islamist insurgency, even when the whole world basically thought that it was history and that it was done with and that it had been defeated. And Erdogan never quite abandoned them. He allowed them to keep that 10% of Syrian territory in which he incubated them, and they were busy arming themselves. So yes, on the one hand, they were just getting ready for this moment. The other thing I think to bear in mind, and there's that great phrase, I think it's from Hemingway, about gradually and then suddenly. I may be misquoting the origin, but gradually and then suddenly. And this phrase really applies to the Assad regime as well. The suddenly we've just witnessed, but what's the gradually? The gradually was that it's impossible to overstate the extent to which the Assad regime and its institutions were rotten from within. And this is something which wasn't widely reported on. I had on two occasions in the course of the last half decade, and a little bit more, the chance to take a look at the regime up close. Once was when I went into Damascus and Aleppo accompanying a pro-regime delegation. And another time was in 2019 when I was able to enter bases of the Syrian Arab Army when they were standing with the Kurds against the Turks around Tel Tamir at that time. Remember, after President Trump's announcement of US withdrawal. And on both occasions, and I wrote about it afterwards, yeah, the extent to which these forces were rotten and decrepit, it was truly astonishing. Infantry battalions of Assad's army up in Tel Tamir in 2019 without sufficient basic medical provision available to them, without even sufficient food available to them. And I know that because they were begging for that stuff. Their officers were begging for that stuff from the Kurdish units that I was spending time with. And the same with regard to spending time in Damascus, seeing just how independent the Russians were in Damascus, doing whatever they wanted, seeing that basic security tasks were being handled by Iranian-associated military forces, just day-to-day security, told us that, or informed us, that the actual regime by itself, without the Iranians and the Russians, was profoundly weak. And I think what we've just witnessed is two things. One is the rebels have been getting ready for some years. But the other thing is that all of a sudden, Bashar al-Assad found himself in a situation where neither the Russians nor the Iranians, who were very clearly the ones who'd saved him from destruction, around a decade ago, were simply not available to help him this time. So what happened was that a fairly capable rebel force came up against an incredibly decrepit and rotten structure, which was known to be rotten by those who'd been watching closely. And what happened was what we've just witnessed.
I mean, it's quite astonishing. I think you're right that, to some extent also, it creates it's something that Israel needs to think about to a large extent as well. I think, first of all, there's the intelligence gap here that once again, nobody really predicted that this was going to happen, right?
Yes.
No one thought a week ago that Assad's about to be gone within a week.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this does touch upon just the assessment, once again, capabilities of Israeli military intelligence and the sorts. But no doubt is that without Iran, without Russia, the moment they stepped aside, Assad on his own was worth nothing, right? Had no legs to stand on.
Absolutely. And what seems to have happened, by the way, because I mean, this in some ways is reminiscent of the Afghan Taliban's lightning advance across Afghanistan a couple of years or 3 years ago, in the sense that very little actual combat appears to have taken place. In most cases, the regime army simply folded and disappeared. And one account in Damascus that I follow quite closely on Twitter, X, just yesterday morning began to show clips and pictures that he was taking where he was saying Syrian army soldiers are changing into civilian clothes and disappearing. That's a kind of almost classic, almost cliche moment, right? Of what happens when regimes collapse. Okay, here's the soldiers all putting on civilian.
By the way, the whole thing is like out of a Hollywood film.
Absolutely.
I mean, the leader gets on a plane, flies off to another country. I mean, it's almost like somebody wrote a script and Assad just went, step by step.
Yeah, it would be a wildly implausible script if it was a script, right? Except it just happens to have taken place.
Sometimes reality is crazier than what Hollywood can come up with. And I think we're seeing that play out. Let me go back for a moment to Turkey, though. What is Erdogan's interest in all of this? Why has he been supporting, maintaining, funding the HTS, Hayat al-Shams, up until now? What has this interest been for him?
Well, I think there are two aspects for Erdogan. One is more concrete, and the second is more long term. The more concrete one is that he wants to destroy what he regards as a PKK statelet that has emerged in Syria over the course of the last decade. And it's worth noting in this regard that HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which you correctly point to, is only one, in fact, of two insurgent formations that Erdogan was incubating in the area of control he permitted the rebels in northwest Syria. And the other one, which is called the SNA, Syrian National Army, or Jaish al-Watani, in many ways is a more direct client of Erdogan and the Turks than HTS is. With regard to HTS, it's worth noting, it's kind of a slightly ironic that HTS is in fact on the Turkish list of terror organizations, right, as well as being on the European and American list. That doesn't mean to
This
say it
guy
doesn't.
Jolani has a $10 million bounty on his head.
Absolutely. So yeah. So now, for anybody who wants that, now's the time. We know they know what city he's in. If you can get to him, you can become get rich. Um, the other force, Jaish al-Watani, is a more direct client of the Turks because it's basically what the Turks themselves cobbled together out of the remnants of the insurgency up in northern Syria, with the exception of HTS, under Turkish tutelage with Turkish backing. And this SNA has been engaged in its own less remarked upon offensive over the last week. Whilst HTS was barreling southwards, this force was pushing eastwards against the Kurds, and it is now engaging Kurdish forces in the area of Menbij. And the intention clearly of Erdogan is to see an end to what he regards as this PKK state. By the way, that's of course a very controversial characterization. The Kurdish operation inside Syria says it's not directly connected to PKK, but the Turks certainly say that it is, and they want to destroy it. So the short-term goal, very clearly from Erdogan's point of view, is to destroy that threat to Turkish national security as he claims to see it.
Does this also have to do with refugees from Syria that he has in Turkey that he wants to get out of Turkey?
Yeah, he's very keen to resettle those refugees. They've become a major domestic issue in Turkey itself. They've not been many of them have not been especially well integrated. There is anger among Turks in southern Turkey because these refugees, of course, are willing to work for very low wages, so they keep Turks out of jobs. All the stuff which is well known regarding refugee issues also in Europe and America and elsewhere is present in Turkey as well.
So let me ask you, I mean, before I want to talk about HTS for a moment, but just before that, the Kurds themselves, I mean, you spent a lot of time with them over the years, and you were just there a few months ago in Syria. You were telling me that you were on the eastern side of Deir ez-Zor, the part controlled by the Kurds, while on the western side of Deir ez-Zor was controlled by the Assad regime in Iran. And just, reminder to some people, Deir ez-Zor, an interesting place, was where in that area where Assad, together with North Korea back in the day, was trying to build a nuclear reactor.
That's right.
So and was an area back in 2014 was actually conquered by ISIS back at the time. Indeed. Yeah. So really, like, what a wild ride this just one region has had. But the Kurds now standing up against the Syrian National Army. How does that force structure, balance of power look like?
Well, I think that the key point with regard to Syrian National Army against the Kurdish SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and of course the YPG, which is the kind of main component of that around which the United States then sort of tacked on various other forces, but the Kurdish YPG against the Syrian National Army, my assessment would be the following. I mean, if it's a straight fight, then the Kurds will destroy the Syrian National Army, which is not a particularly effective force. HTS is a vastly more serious and well-disciplined and cohesive force. But of course, the reality in the northern area, the northern border area, of Syria, given the nature of the Syrian National Army and its associations, is that it's quite possible that if a big battle begins, it won't just be a straight fight between the SDF and the Syrian National Army, because the Syrian National Army will be directly supported by the armed forces of Turkey, with regard to artillery, potentially with regard to drones, with regard to missiles, and that could be a game changer from the Kurdish point of view. SDF is only a lightly armed force. The people who've helped them with those kind of capacities in the past when they were fighting against ISIS are, of course, the United States and its allies. But that, of course, isn't going to happen this time.
And so, you're not going to have a battle between the U.S. with the Kurds and the Syrian National Army with Turkey. I mean, these are also
Right.
two NATO
No,
countries, which is
that's
kind of
right.
like,
That's not going to
which,
happen. So, which means
right.
that's why if that would have happened to finish, if that would have happened, then that's a scenario which deeply worries the Kurds right now, and which they're thinking about quite a lot.
So what? So if you had a crystal ball, Jonathan, and you had to say, okay, what's going to happen in Syria over the next few years? The two dominant players are going to be America and Turkey.
Well, don't forget Russia also. I mean, Russia has been, powerfully involved in Syria all the way back to the 1960s, backing up the Ba'athi and then Assad regimes. The Russian decision, because I think people think because of the commitments in Ukraine not to bail Assad out this time, doesn't mean that the Russians are now simply going to abandon permanently their holdings in Syria.
And
Now,
they are on the coast,
on the
right?
coast,
That's
yeah,
where they have
Latakia
their
province.
presence.
The two naval facilities in Tartus and Latakia, and then the big air base in Khmeimim. It doesn't mean the Russians are just going to abandon those, I don't think. So don't forget Russia. So yes, Russia, and then Turkey, and then the United States of America, of course, and of course also Iran. I mean, the fact is, once again, the fact that the regime has been defeated doesn't mean that the Iranian interest vanishes. Let us not forget that the Iranians in the past have found their way to work with Sunni Islamists, right? We shouldn't get into too schematic or simplistic a notion that, okay, now the Sunnis have conquered Syria, so now the Iranians have nobody to talk to. No, not necessarily. I mean, the Iranians work pretty well with Hamas, right? They've
Right.
worked pretty well with al-Qaeda also in various regional contexts. So, it doesn't mean the Iranians are out of the game. So, yeah, basically, Syria, I think, is going to continue to be a playground, if I can put it that way a little bit cynically, of both regional and global powers. I don't see any likely scenario in which Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, so to speak, now manages to reunite Syria along Hafez al-Assad's line, of a powerful centralized country with very clearly demarcated borders that then sort of becomes a regional player in its own right once again. I mean, listen, who knows? But that wouldn't be my money wouldn't be on that bet right now.
So let's talk about him for a moment, right?
Mm.
There was the Nusra Front. We all remember them from back in the
Yeah.
first iteration of the Civil War, offshoot
Hmm.
of Al Qaeda. He
Hmm.
is in charge back in 2016, officially cuts off or severs ties with Al Qaeda, right?
That's
No
right.
longer a subsidiary of the mothership. But
Hmm.
these are not, I mean, like you said, these aren't liberal progressives, these aren't
No.
Zionists. I mean, what do they want? What are they going to do? And also, how do they view us? How do they view the state of Israel?
First of all, what they want is kind of clear because what they want is what they've already created in Idlib province, and what they want is to extend that mode of governance throughout Syria. And what they've created is an Islamist, a Salafi jihadi Islamist statelet in which Sharia law is the law, and in which Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its various leaders have key roles, and behind which Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, without any specific role, by the way, is the undisputed single leader. A
Mhm.
very dominant and dictatorial leader. So that is the model which they're clearly going to, or which I think they're going to try to impose on Syria. Now, what al-Jolani himself has said in recent days is, no, there's time, we're going to have an interim government, and then we're going to have elections, and Syrians are going to choose who they want to be ruled by. Yeah, I don't think that will happen in the sense in which maybe, maybe that sounds like. I think that al-Jolani is heading towards an authoritarian form of Sunni Islamic rule, as he has imposed on Idlib over the last decade or so. So yeah, that's where I think they're heading. With regard to how they see Israel, I mean, I wouldn't, first of all, the guy is called Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, right? The name Jolani that he's chosen, from what I understand at least, is because his parents, allegedly at least, were refugees from the Syrian Golan from Israel's conquest in 1967. Turkey, while not being, of course, in a state of conflict with Israel, supports
No,
people
not a
who
good
are.
friend.
It's
No.
certainly by no means a friend. So I would think that, should once al-Jolani solidifies his rule in at least part of Syria, as it looks likely that he will, there will be, a form of hostility towards Israel. Whether that takes the form of, open warfare or of support for insurgency is a very different matter. He's going to be very busy with other stuff for a long time to come. But this al-Jolani's state, if it emerges, will be a state in alliance with Qatar and Turkey and that Sunni Islamist bloc, which looked to be in decline for the last few years in the region, and which suddenly, with the insurgent victory in Syria, should be very much back on everybody's mind. That's, I think, where this is headed.
On the other hand, they have tried, they did that rebranding. It's as if like the
Yeah,
Qataris sent in their Al Jazeera media specialists a couple years ago and said, hey
yeah.
guys, don't be with Al Qaeda, call yourselves a new name, give it a cool
Hmm.
English acronym, HTS. They allow Christians apparently to pray. I read somewhere in Idlib. They just announced
Hmm.
the other day that in some Christian town near Aleppo, they're going to allow still freedom of religion. So they're trying
Yeah.
to, at least for the time being, put on an image for the West that we're good, right? You're going to want to work with us. I mean, this is deliberate, right? Like they don't want to make an enemy out of America. They want
Definitely.
to
Yeah.
get something from America. How do you understand this move?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's pragmatic in the extreme, and I think it's very smart. And it also it's a natural sort of latest step, really, in Abu Muhammad al-Jolani's quite remarkable career, in which he has gone from being, a member of not only a member of Al-Qaeda, but if we can think of various franchises of Al-Qaeda and kind of grade them, it's a very, very extreme network in any case. But the Al-Qaeda branch of Iraq, the branch created, if you remember, by the late Abu Musa al-Zarqawi, was really one of the most astonishingly violent terrorist groups,
Oh
I
yeah.
think, which has ever been witnessed. Most of its violence was directed against Shia Iraqis, which is why maybe it wasn't quite imprinted on the Western consciousness in the same way. This was a profoundly, vicious and violent terror organization. And al-Jolani's career begins as a militant with that organization. But from the very outset, when he returns to Syria, two things have been clear. One is that the guy is profoundly ambitious in his own right, and so he simply wasn't willing to buckle under when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi came to him and said, "Great, you're now going to be a kind of branch of ISIS." Yeah, he refused that. And secondly, he's proven able to show a great deal of tactical flexibility, and the abandonment of the Al-Qaeda global jihad agenda in 2016 is an example of that, and the building of the relationship with the Turks is another example, and he's clearly shown that level of flexibility. I suspect that that will continue. So I think what he wants is he wants power, and he clearly is committed to a certain set of ideas, but he's willing to be flexible in terms of the realization of those in the interests of having and extending his own power. And that's the spirit. I mean, that kind of describes, I guess, most ideological leaders in our region who get to stick around rather than being kind of rapidly, taken out of the game like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was. You make a certain adjustment to reality. That shouldn't mean anybody has any illusions about you, especially not somebody looking at it from the Israeli point of view. After all, precisely, in my view at least, the central strategic misunderstanding which leads Israel to October 7th is the notion that because Yahya Sinwar appears to be quite an effective mayor of Gaza City, that he must be happy with being that, and that we can start to think of him as the mayor of Gaza City. That was wrong. We mistook tactical flexibility for strategic change. And I think it would be quite wrong to make a similar mistake regarding Abu Muhammad al-Jolani.
On the other hand, though, and I'm not here to defend the fairy tales, as I call them, or the myths
Uh-huh.
that led to October 7th. But on the other hand, you also have an instance where people like Al Jolani have never been in positions of government, really. Yes, Idlib and the province with the support of Turkey, but now you potentially are on the verge of taking over an entire country, which is mostly a failed state and is splintered and
Mm.
fractured without real
Mhm.
economic growth. I mean, this is going to be a massive challenge for him. Now, obviously, it's something that you want to deflect and distract, go to war with Israel or try to get the Israelis engaged in some way. That's always going to be a good tactic. So my question is, if you were in an Israeli decision-making position, or if the prime minister called you up and said, Jonathan, what should I do? Well, what should he do?
For the moment, at least, first of all, it is absolute chaos in Damascus at the moment. I've been speaking to people there, and it is far too soon to have any clear picture of what's going on. Nobody knows what's going on. Right now, what everybody needs to do is wait. This is very, very clear. With regard to communication with the emergent government, well, Israel speaks to Turkey. We are also aware that Israel has pretty good channels of communication to Qatar, for better or for worse. So it's not difficult to have, channels of communication with the new government. I think what Israel should also do, it should use this period of chaos, as it seems like it is doing, and I think that's good. It should use this period of chaos to deal with tangible dangers that it clearly perceives as existing, whether that is chemical weapons stockpiles, stockpiles of particular weaponry, or indeed pushing out areas of de facto Israeli control from the Golan to the Syrian side of the Golan, to create facts on the ground for whatever happens next. I also think that Israel should be cognizant of the potential dangers of a Salafi jihadi takeover of Syria. And therefore, I would hope, also for strategic reasons, that Israel is keeping channels of communication open with other entities on the ground in Syria, specifically the Druze close to the border in the Sweda area, and of course the Kurds east of the Euphrates, because those are going to be players as well. It's not that al-Zulani has the stage all to himself, and those are players that Israel can work very successfully and effectively with, and they're going to be power centers of their own. So I'd say channels of communication open to those forces at the same time is also very significant and important.
What is the lesson here or the takeaway with regards to Iran? I mean, I've been looking at this and I say to myself to an extent, and I hate to be the warmonger, but the Iranians had created this sword that was hovering above our
Right.
heads all the time. And it was in the
Yeah.
form of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iran and the Syrian regime and their Scud missiles and chemical weapons and the Iranian entrenchment there, and of course Iran itself. But if you look over the last 14 months, Hamas pretty much gone, Hezbollah severely weakened, leadership decimated, Syria now done in the Assad form of it, Iran vulnerable and exposed after we took out their air defense systems back in October. Is there not an opportunity, in your view, for a move against what has the potential to really be a dramatic threat against the state of Israel, that being Iran's nuclear program, which the world has kind of stayed away from until now? Is this not a moment that maybe Israeli decision makers should say to themselves, well, we should actually, we don't have the Iranians, as you mentioned, are isolated, are weakened, are more vulnerable, and the threat, the price or the cost of an attack, which we used to think would come in the form of missiles from
Yeah.
Lebanon, Gaza,
Right.
Syria, we now know that's not the case. So is that not an amazing opportunity that Israel should really consider?
First of all, I think we should note, with regard to the nuclear file, that there is evidence that the Iranians are now pushing forward with greater speed on the nuclear file, both from Rafael Grossi and from Avril Haines in the US. In the last 3 days, there have been reports suggesting increased activity with regard to enrichment to 60%. So the sense is that the Iranians, having now seen their proxy model, pretty much reduced to a very, very pitiful state, could now turn back to the other two components of their projection of power in recent years. One is the nuclear program. The other, of course, is production of ballistic missiles. In terms of answer to your question, my answer would just be yes, absolutely. I mean, if you're faced with a power that is committed to your destruction, and then you deliver some very telling hits on that power, it's natural and obvious that your next stage should be counterattack, should be okay. The enemy is now weakened, but the enemy remains committed to Israel's destruction. It remains committed in principle to its goal of regional domination. So absolutely move forward, whether it's against the nuclear facilities, which I can certainly see a great deal of logic to, but whether it's also towards a process of supporting regime change in Iran itself. I don't mean by sending an infantry division barreling all the way down to Tehran, of course. But I mean, in terms of supporting real support, to those forces within Iran at a time when Iran is profoundly vulnerable, at a time when its economy is in a mess, and at a time when as we saw just a couple of years ago, a massive part of the Iranian population don't want this regime. So there's a huge amount to work with in Iran. And yeah, if I was advising the Prime Minister of Israel or indeed the President-elect of the United States, I would say, yeah, this is the time to now move forward to that real profound strategic historic change that is maybe visible in the region now, which would be the bringing down of Islamic Republic of Iran itself. Because as long as Islamic Republic of Iran is around, anybody who wants the kind of positive developments in the region represented by Abraham Accords and so on, will find there's still a massive obstacle to any possibility of that. That Islamic Republic of Iran, in my view, has to go to make that chance of real forward movement in the region possible. And it is possible right now.
So I want to ask you, Jonathan, before I let you go. I mean, you're one of the few people I know who has been numerous times to Syria in the last few years. I don't even know how many, but you probably but a significant
for a while, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, a significant number of times that you've traveled there, definitely since the Civil War began, 2011, 2012. And, it's a country that has long been fractured but there's positive there, right? There's beauty there.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of history there. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
how do you feel, just someone who knows these people, in Syria, who actually knows Syrians, as you're watching what's happening?
I mean, in one way, I really do feel, a lot of happiness for people as I've been following closely and speaking with friends over the last 24, 48 hours, and that's not in any way, I'm deeply cognizant of, the challenges to Israel with regard to this, the history regarding Israel and Syria and so on. All of that, of course, I'm deeply cognizant of. And nevertheless, it is, moving to watch over the last 48 hours Syrians reacting to, for example, the liberation of Sadnaya jail. This dreadful, house of incarceration and torture that the Assad regime maintained.
I saw people who had been in jail for decades
Yeah, for like people, for like 40 years. There were people there who thought that Hafiz Assad was still alive, and when the rebels came in, they thought it was Saddam Hussein's army that had come to rescue them. Some people who've been just literally taken out of off the earth, so to speak, and down this black hole of Sadnaya, and then suddenly being liberated. And the sense, because the Assad regime really was a terribly repressive system, first and foremost to its own people. So the clear sense of just relief that's coming with people suddenly feeling that the burden of that being lifted is profoundly impressive to see, without in any way discounting any of the challenges that will very soon come. I kind of chose to take a few hours and say, okay, I'll go back to thinking about that 4 or 5 hours time. Right now, I'm just going to feel happy for my Syrian friends, and that's kind of what I've been trying to do in the last hours.
So I heard a lot of people say, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. But you know what? Sometimes the bad guys need to lose, and
Yeah.
obviously what will come, we'll have to deal with.
Right.
But there is justice in the sense that Assad has been removed from power. These were not good people.
Yeah,
And
well, I certainly believe that too. Absolutely.
yeah. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on the show, and to our viewers and listeners, thank you very much for being with us. You can catch us always on Mondays and Thursdays on YouTube, podcast, different platforms, Spotify and Apple.